Q&A, so the floor's open.
Can I start?
Yeah, sure.
So, in the previous lecture, Rabbi came here and he gave us a question. He gave us a Gemara, and he said there were two tzaddikim and they got married for 10 years and they couldn't have kids, so they went out and they married other partners, right? And it was they used this Gemara okay, so what happened is they got married for 10 years to two tzaddikim on the same level, and then the wife got married to a man on a spiritual level lower than hers, and then she managed to lift his spiritual level up, and the man got married to a woman with a spiritual level lower than his, and she pulled him down. So I was wondering if every Gemara, is that just a specific one-time thing, or is every Gemara, does that represent the average person?
Well, you just presented two extremes, and often the truth is somewhere in between. The Gemara wouldn't tell you something that was only true about one case, because then what would you learn from it? History has in it an infinity of facts. So whenever something is presented from history, there has to be a reason why this was chosen and all the rest were rejected. Usually it's because you can learn something from it. Are there exceptions? Yeah, usually there are exceptions to rules. To find absolutely universal rules is extremely, extremely difficult. Do black holes radiate? Yeah, according to Hawking, they do, and disappear. So to have the idea that it should be absolutely universal or only a one-time event, neither of them is going to be a correct interpretation. I'll give you a tiny bit of background, and then if you push me, I'll give you more. The Torah says, by the way, I think it's a medrash, it's not a Gemara if I'm not mistaken. The Torah says that a woman was created Ezer Kenegdo, a helper corresponding to him or against him. It's taken both ways. Now, there's a double message in those words. One message is that it portrays her role. The other message is he has to know he needs help. She wouldn't have been created to help him unless he needs help. And if he thinks he doesn't need help, he's in serious trouble. So you're looking for a relationship in which she has a role in helping him become what he needs to become. Well, that means she has a very strong influence on his development. Now, that midrash is just applying it to a very specific element, very specific character, the moral status or spiritual status of the person. And yes, a woman has a tremendous effect on the moral status of her husband. Not always will it be determinate, but a man needs to know he needs her as his influence to grow and how to respond to that, and she needs to know that that's her responsibility. So very often that is going to be the way the outcome takes place. I think that's the right way to look at those kinds of cases, whether it's really portraying what looks like a particular case, we're just supposed to learn something from it. We were taught about 300 years ago when I was a child, not to use stereotypes. Well, like many things in popular culture, that's dead wrong. Stereotypes get to be stereotypes because they're generally right. They aren't fantasies. And if you're going to spend a week in Italy, you better know the stereotypes. Otherwise, how do you know how to relate to people? Are there exceptions? Of course there are exceptions. Should you be aware that there are exceptions and on the lookout for them? Of course you should. But that doesn't mean you should ignore the stereotypes, because 8 times out of 10, the stereotype will serve you very well. And if you go with no stereotype, then you're going to make a lot of mistakes. So, it's in the middle ground between taking it as an absolute rule, which you don't want to do, versus discarding it as important information, which you don't want to do either. Both are not correct responses. Oh. Yeah.
If no one's going to ask anything.
This is Q&A. Yeah.
Last week we learned about Bala and the curses and the effect of curses. Can you tell me, in more than example, such an evil eye, how does it work and how to protect ourselves from the evil eye?
Okay, it's a big subject. The whole idea of the evil eye is big. So I'll tell you one explanation that I heard many years ago when I was living in Baltimore, which is definitely an approach to it, and it gives you some practical advice what to do about it. Evil eye takes place when A is disturbed by some success that B has, and he prays that B should lose it. So you say, well, what do you mean? And God listens to that vicious prayer that B should lose it? Why would God do that? Well, this is Rabbi Moshe Heinemann in Baltimore. He said, well, consider in your own mind people you know and ask yourself, how would you respond to the news that that person won the lottery? I think for different people, your response would be different. For some people, you would say, wow, he won the lottery? That's great. That's terrific. That's wonderful. And for other people, you would say, he won the lottery? What a waste. What a miscarriage of justice. It's terrible that he won the lottery. What's the difference? One difference is, how does he use his money? Does he care about other people? Does he support other people? Is he generous with other people? If he is, and you find out that he won the lottery, you would probably be very pleased that he won the lottery. If he was selfish, if he was competitive and destructive, and he won the lottery, you would feel it was unjust and unfair and bad for the world that he won the lottery. So how we feel about other people's success depends to a great extent on what they do with their success. So now you have to ask, A is praying to God that B should lose the success he has. Why is A praying like that? Why is he doing that? One reason can be, often, that B doesn't use his success in a sensitive and generous way. And then he deserves to be taken down. He deserves to have something, some loss in that success. And indeed, the Torah actually describes that. It describes that sort of thing where A borrows money from B, and B takes a mashkan in Hebrew, a guarantee, takes some object to guarantee the loan. And according to the Torah's law, if it's a practical object, like a piece of clothing, the lender has to return the item to the borrower when he needs it, and only take it back when he doesn't need it. And if he doesn't do that, then the Torah says, and if the borrower is upset and angry, then God will take it out on the lender. I lent him money. Yeah, but he was also supposed to give back the surety, and he didn't do that. So, Ein Hara can come from the way in which a person uses the success that he has. And the practical advice, which is actually brought down in the Gemara and in the Poskim, is keep a low profile. Keep a low profile. Don't attract people's attention. Don't show off the success that you have. I'll give you a tiny example of it. Let's say you have a celebration, and in shul, to recognize the celebration, on Shabbos they give you and your family an aliyah to the Torah, which is an honor that's given. Don't take two successively, one after the other. Interrupt yours with other people. So it doesn't look like, oh, they got that one, and they got that one, and they got that one. And people get nervous about it. You get upset. Don't attract attention. So they don't show off the successes that you have. And that's a way to not excite that kind of envy, in which case you lose it. So that there can be cases where there's a vicious prayer, God won't listen to it. That will be the case where the person who has the success didn't use it in an appropriate way. But sometimes it is so that he did use it in an appropriate way. That's one type of Ayin Hara. Yeah.
I actually had a long question. So you have like the Oraita law, you have the Rabbanan law, and you have like series of different rules in Judaism. You have like Chumrah, Halacha, you have a Minhag, you have a Masora, you have all these different degradations, or I guess you'd say of like rules.
Gradations.
Gradations, right? So I'm curious, what's like top to bottom of like, what is top to bottom of what's needed? Sometimes I think we're mixing Chumrah with the Minhag.
Yeah. So believe it or not, it sounds simple, but there's a sort of tricky element in the question that you're asking. Let's take two examples of the number of categories that you mentioned, and I'll show you how a hierarchy could be stated and what's tricky about it. Deoraisa means this is a law which God himself enabled. That is it's either written down in the Torah, it's part of the oral tradition, and it came to the people from Moses, directly from God. The Rabbana means the rabbis made it up. The rabbis invented it. Now, when you look at it in practice, let's say there's a conflict between, I'm sitting in a position where there's a Deoraisa, biblical law applies to me, and there's a Rabbanan, rabbinic law applies to me, and in my circumstances I can't do both. I can do either one, but not both. Almost always, not always, but almost always, I should fulfill the biblical law and violate the rabbinic law. Let's suppose a law applies to me, and I'm not sure whether I fulfilled it or not. The law requires me to do something. I don't remember clearly whether I did it or not. If it's a biblical law, I have to go back and do it again. I have to be sure that I've done it. If it's a rabbinic law, I don't have to go back and do it again. You look at the penalties. The penalties for violating biblical laws are much more strict, generally, than the penalties for violating rabbinic laws. Now you hear those things and you say, well, obviously the biblical laws are more important. And that's not too surprising, is it? Something that is ordained by God himself will have more importance, more strictness, more authority, it seems, than the laws that the rabbis ordained. But according to most authorities, that conclusion is incorrect. That conclusion is incorrect. How could it be incorrect? You see by the examples that I gave you that the biblical laws are stricter than the rabbinic laws. Well, let's see. Let's take a legislature that enacts laws, a secular legislature. And some of the crimes that they enact are felonies, and some of the crimes are misdemeanors. Well, usually the penalty for violating a felony is very strict, and the penalty for violating a misdemeanor is much less strict. But it's the same legislature, it's the same representatives, and it's exactly the same authority. The fact that the felonies are more strict and the misdemeanors are less strict doesn't mean the authority behind them is less strict, less serious, less powerful. No, the authority is exactly the same legislature. The legislature wrote the leniencies into the misdemeanors, and the legislature wrote the strictness into the felonies, because the legislature wanted the laws to be treated in different ways. But that doesn't mean the authority is less. So, let's say you're talking about rabbinic laws. Well, where do the rabbis get the authority to make any laws altogether? The answer is it's based on explicit verses in the Torah, together with the oral tradition that comes from Moses. That is God's legislation, which gives them their authority. Okay, so now that means if someone violates a rabbinic law, he's going against God's will. Because God said, follow the laws of the rabbis. So when we say that the rabbinic legislation has these weaknesses that I described, that's because the rabbis wrote those weaknesses into the legislation. They wrote it in because they wanted their laws to have a less stringent effect. Not because the authority is less. The authority is exactly the same. Most interpreters understand that the rabbinic laws all have divine authority behind them. The analogy that's given is you have a king, and he has a far-flung empire, and he has provinces over which he's king, and he appoints a governor over each province. And each governor gets a charter by the authority of the king. So-and-so is the governor of this province, and his laws have to be obeyed. And now the governor makes a law for his province, and some citizen violates the governor's law. And he's taken and accused of rebelling against the king. And he says, King Schming, who's talking about the king here? You know, George is the governor, and I just didn't do what George wants. He's mistaken, because George's authority was ordained by the king. So the rabbis' laws have biblical force. It's just that they wrote them to have less strength than the ones that came directly from God. And therefore, this is being recorded, so you can go back and check every time I said generally, because there are cases where the rabbinic law will take precedence over the biblical law. There are such cases. That's where they didn't make it less. They used the full force of their authority, and then, given certain rules, they can actually cause you to fulfill the rabbinic and violate the biblical. They have the ability to do that because their ultimate authority for what they're doing is also biblical. That's some background before you get to the ranking of all the categories. You have to know what the ranking means. That's a little bit of background. Yeah.
When you said a second ago, this is just jumping on Shmuel's question, that that one of the commandments from Hashem is to listen to your rabbis. Is that it falls under the listen to the sages? Yeah, is that correct? Is the wording to the rabbis, and I guess what makes a rabbi or a group of rabbis considered like enough, high enough, or safe as one of the sages?
Okay, I'll give you just a little bit of the background here. This is based on explicit verses in the Torah. My reading glasses here. Okay. Here's what the Torah says. Well, I'll translate. I guess reading the Hebrew for you probably won't help much. When you will have a legal matter which escapes you, you have a circumstance arises, and you live in a certain area, and your local courts examine it, and they don't come to a determination. And it specifies all different types of legal matters that might apply to you. You should arise and go to the place which Hashem will choose, and come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judges who will be in those days, and you shall analyze, and they will tell you what the law is. And you shall do according to what they tell you from that place. Okay, so it's like a Supreme Court. There's a difficulty, and the local courts can't handle it, and you go to the place. This is what we call the Sanhedrin, and they take the matter under their consideration, and then they come to a decision. They tell you what to do, and then you are told to fulfill what they tell you to do. Now, given the problem we started with and the reaction, could we end the paragraph here? Now we could talk about baseball and apples? I think so. The problem was you don't know what to do. You go to the highest court, you tell them, they analyze, they give you a judgment, and you have to follow what they tell you to do. Now it's time for another subject. But, in fact, the verses go on, with respect to the same circumstance, they go on and say more. They say, and you shall be careful to do according to all that they will teach you. Well, they already gave you the decision. You're already told to follow that. There's something else called all that they will teach you. And then it goes on. According to the Torah that they will teach you, and according to the law that they will tell you, shall you do. That's two more things. So we've got three more things above and beyond the decision of this court, like a Supreme Court, to tell you the law in a particular practical case. So obviously this body of people has other functions than just deciding a case that came before them. There's Torah they teach you, and a law they teach you, and you have to follow it. You have to be careful to guard it. Don't turn aside from the thing that they tell you, right or left. And now it's followed by a prohibition. Don't deviate from what they tell you. So all of this indicates that this body, which is introduced initially as a Supreme Court, a judicial function, has other functions as well. Now, this is one of the cases where you have the written Torah and the oral Torah working hand in hand. What are those extra functions? Well, the Maimonides in his Hilchos Mamrim says there are two other functions. One function is legislative. It's not only a judicial function, but it also can create legislation. And also, they have the responsibility to identify the authentic tradition. There are many statements, even writings, that are associated with the tradition, and some of them have become corrupted by miscopying, and some of them have been introduced by sources that aren't always trustworthy. And one of their jobs is to identify the validity of the tradition. So this is a biblical source for the authority of the rabbis to create legislation, and that means that they're being told that they should do that, and we should follow what they say. That's what the words say, word for word. So, and then how it works out in detail is carried out by the oral tradition. Yeah.
And just before we stray too far away from that, how do we determine who are the rabbis who create these rules that we should listen to? Because not that a secular person would be reading the Chumash, but right, they open up the Chumash and they read the sentence like, oh, I should go ask my Reform synagogue rabbi what to do, but they're not really going to have necessarily the same answers. But
they won't have the same answers. They won't have the same questions. They won't have the same literature. They won't have the same scholarly background. They will be very different. That's quite right. And they won't have the same goals. They won't have the same goals. There's a reason why the group is called Reform, because it means we're not bound by the tradition. We reform it. We change it. We remold it in an image that pleases us. You're certainly not going to get the same answers from people who are trying to interpret, apply the tradition that goes back to Moses. They're happy to rebel against that tradition. They announce themselves as such. One of the groups is called Reconstructionism. That means we construct it again, anew, in the vision, in the image that pleases us. So, in the ancient times, the first Sanhedrin was appointed by Moses. That's explicit in the Torah. It assisted him in the wilderness before he died. After that, it became institutionalized in the following way. Learning, analyzing, understanding, remembering, and applying the Torah is if not the major challenge of the nation. It's culturally the top priority. So you have a kind of constant talent search being running continuously, and the people who succeed are pushed up level by level from local expertise to higher levels. The Sanhedrin was a group of 71 scholars. I don't know if anywhere in any culture of the world your highest court has 71 members. That's something which is unique about our judicial system. And sitting together with them were the next 71 greatest scholars in order of ability, so that if one of the 71 of the Sanhedrin had to leave for whatever reason, he could be replaced. And if one died or had to retire, then he would be replaced permanently. And it was in order of the other 71. So the second group of 71 are sitting there, many of them for years, observing and participating in the discussion with the Sanhedrin. So they got on-the-job training, first-hand training in what it meant to be a member of the Sanhedrin. So when they graduated up, they were really very well prepared to graduate up. So that's the way it was set up. When the Sanhedrin was lost around the 4th century of the Common Era, because in order to qualify for the Sanhedrin, you had to have a certain ordination called smicha, and that had to be person to person, for those who got it, starting with Moses, and it died because of the Roman persecutions. The line of ordination died. So now what we have is this. We have a kind of national, informal, scholarly competition. People give lectures. People write their research and their findings and their ideas, and then they're discussed and debated by others. And there's a natural hierarchy that emerges from that kind of natural competition. Let me give you examples of things which you're quite familiar with. Who are the top 10 baseball players? Well, you might have some discussion. There might be, let's say, 20, some of whom say are the top and aren't in the top, but you won't have 450, all of whom have supporters who say they're in the top 10. That won't happen. Because you know what baseball is, you know what talent is, you know what performance is, and you have a natural hierarchy of people who are talented in baseball, or violinists, or mathematicians or organic cooks. They're going to be people who are at the top of the competition. These people are the people who know the Torah best, understand it best, and can apply it best in accordance with what the Creator who gave the Torah wants. They get a kind of natural authority. In English, the word authority is beautifully ambiguous. A person who's elected a senator has legal authority. Then you talk about, you say, he's an authority on Chinese history. Nobody elected him. Nobody appointed him. There's no law that says you have to treat him some way. He just knows it better than everybody else. So he's an authority on that. I think that carries a moral connotation as well, because if you need to decide something and you don't go to the authority, you flip a coin, you're irresponsible. If there are authorities, that's where you ought to go to get the decision. So the authority that people have nowadays is the authority of knowing the Torah and understanding it best and analyzing it and applying it. And they carry authority for us, not because it's legally ordained authority, but simply because they're the ones who can give us the best guidance as to how to live the way the Torah wants us to live. That's some story. Yeah.
I want to ask the Rabbi quite an emotional question about doubt. How if one is struggling from doubt, how that could affect his service of Hashem, his connection to Hashem, and how one should go about being doubtful. If he should doubt the doubt.
Well, that's a smart move. People pride themselves in being skeptics. Typically, the only thing that they're not skeptical of is their own skepticism. And in fact, Socrates was accused of that by one of the modern philosophers, because Socrates' deal was this. Somebody came along and said, I know Q. And Socrates says, oh, you do? How do you know that? Me, Socrates? I don't know anything. My wisdom is I know my ignorance. That was his claim to fame. But you say you know. Well, let's see if you know or not. Okay, and here's how the game is played. I'll question you and I'll analyze and I'll raise objections and see whether you can defend yourself. Nobody asked Socrates, where are your standards for proof? What are your standards for evidence? Why do you think that's a convincing refutation of what he said? There's no such thing as having no position. No such thing as having no commitments. There are always commitments. So you have to be skeptical of your skepticism as well. But now there are different types of skepticism and different types of doubts. My training's in philosophy. So the joke was, well, there are two types. There are philosophical doubts and serious doubts. And they're exclusive. Maybe you're dreaming. Can you prove you're not dreaming? Look at that, said Descartes. Well, you don't even know whether you're dreaming or not. That's called the philosophical doubt, right? But try doubting that this is a table. I don't know. Is it really a table? I'm not sure. I'm sort of worried about it. I can't feel confidence. I don't think that's the way you feel about it. What you feel about it is, I don't know, these philosophers spend their time talking about silly things like whether you know you're dreaming or not, and maybe they make a living doing it, but I think there's something is important, like investing in stocks. then leave me alone. So there's a big difference between the abstract question, can you prove it? What would be a proof? And is it possible you're mistaken? Versus, I don't know what to do, because maybe. Maybe the world was created 5 minutes ago, and all the memories you have are false memories. Can you prove it's not true? Okay, fine. But now, when you've lent money to someone, and your memory tells you it's 2 weeks ago, do you then refuse to pay back when he asks for it? Because prove you existed 2 weeks ago. I think maybe you existed and came into this only 5 minutes ago, and the whole thing's a false memory. You don't do that if you're an honest person. And if you're the lender, you certainly don't do it. Certainly don't, how much should I collect my money? I can't prove to him that it wasn't created 5 minutes ago. So maybe I didn't really handle the money. I don't think so. I think you go and collect your money with full confidence and no conscience struck, maybe I'm stealing somebody else's money. So if you have what's called a philosophical doubt, that's not very serious. Indeed, the purpose of philosophical doubt is to stimulate you to think about how things are argued, what kinds of things are evident, what kinds of things are proof, and not to shake your confidence. I'll give you one practical example. You know that your retina is two-dimensional. It's a flat surface of it's like in a cone, but it's two-dimensional, it's not three-dimensional, right? The world that you see is three-dimensional, right? You see three different independent dimensions. How do you do that with a two-dimensional array of sensors? How do you get a three-dimensional image from a two-dimensional array of sensors? That was a big problem. For hundreds of years, it was a big problem. It was solved more or less in the 50s and 60s. A fellow named Gibson was one of the big people who solved it. Did anybody say, gee, the array of sensors is only two-dimensional. Two-dimensional sensors can only give you a two-dimensional information. So we really don't see three dimensions? Nobody said that. What they said is, we don't know how. We don't know how it happened, so we'll try to figure out how it happened. So the fact that you have a gap in your ability to prove or support or analyze or reason doesn't always create a real doubt as to what the facts are. I call this keeping your philosophical balance. This goes back to G.E. Moore at Cambridge in the beginning of the 20th century, how he refuted idealism. There's a lot of literature. I'm just giving you a couple of examples. There's a famous mathematical example, you can look it up, how to prove that 1 equals 2. I suppose you're familiar with this. And you look at it, and every step looks absolutely, it's just elementary. It's not even algebra, it's just, you have an equation, do the same thing, the two sides of the equation, and you end up with 1 equals 2. And the question is, what do you do now? Well, here, there are two paths open, one of which is right, and the other of which is dumb. One which is right is to say, look, 1 doesn't equal 2. It just doesn't. Sorry. You have a proof that makes it so. There's got to be something wrong with the proof, even though I don't know what's wrong with the proof. My bet is there's something wrong with the proof. The wrong move is to say, look, proof is proof, and if you're only logical and reasonable if you follow proof, so it's proved that 1 is 2, accept it, and live with it. 1 equals 2. No, that's not correct. That's not correct. There's a competition in strength between the proof on the one hand and the ridiculousness of the conclusion. And sometimes the conclusion is so ridiculous that you simply say, I'm not following the conclusion, I'm betting that the proof has a mistake, even if I don't know what the mistake is, and that's not inappropriate. So keeping your philosophical balance is tricky and something that you have to keep in mind. Yeah?
Can you talk a little about music? So we're coming up with the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, and one of the things we don't do is we don't listen to music. But also, interestingly, I've noticed that in Kabbalah Shabbat and in Shachris, you see a lot of psalms brought up that talk about playing a 10-string instrument, singing to Hashem. So this is a couple of things that are contrasting. One is that we're not supposed to usually, I don't think, play stringed instruments on Shabbat, but then they bring those psalms specifically into the services that I find interesting. And then the other thing is, even though we're in the middle of the 3 weeks, we're not supposed to listen to music. Does that mean music would be permissible on Shabbat, or is it not? It seems like there's a lot of contradicting ideas there regarding music and these occasions.
Well, the idea of defining it in terms of music is a fairly recent idea. Now, for us, fairly recent could be 1,000 years, because what's that in 3,300 years? In America, a house that's 100 years old is marked an antique. And as Jews, we find that a little amusing. For us, that's 5 minutes ago. The truth is, the real prohibition is against expressions of joy. There are those. I'm not qualified to give you practical Jewish legal decisions. So if I tell you something, if you want to know whether it applies to you, ask someone who is. But there are those who say that only music that is designed to produce Jewish rejoicing is forbidden. So, for example, there are those who say that classical music is permissible. The way I heard it from someone for whom I have great respect was, classical music isn't music. I have to love classical music. I was a musician for many years, so it was a little bit of a painful remark. But vis-a-vis the circumstances, so it's not so much that. And then it's usually instrumental music, not vocal music. And in fact, there are recordings of vocal, a cappella choir that are made for this period of time, where you don't have any instruments whatsoever, and because of that, it would be permitted. But you're connecting to the great tragedy in the Jewish history. Twice it happened. We're connected to the later one because it's later, closer to us in time, the destruction of the temple, and therefore not only don't you listen to music, but you don't make weddings. Weddings. Aren't you supposed to get married? Isn't it a mitzvah to get married? Yeah, but not now. Not now. Right? The Psalms were written at a time when none of these things applied. The book of Psalms was edited by King David. He didn't write it, but it was edited. It was written by various, Gemara says 10 authors. And that was before the building of the first temple. So all of that would not. So now what you say is, yes, the Psalms have in it the mention of the use of instrumental music, but that just means it is an important factor in Jewish life. It doesn't mean it has to apply every day and every night, 24 hours, 24/7. The fact that we don't use instruments on Shabbos is rabbinic, because most instruments can need some kind of adjustment so that they'll play correctly. You tune the violin, the strings of the violin, before you play. The tuning is something which makes it playable from not being playable, and that could be a biblical prohibition. So the rabbi said, don't use instruments. In the temple, they used instruments, and they used instruments on Shabbos because these prohibitions didn't exist in the temple. So it is something which is context dependent, but music, as a feature of Jewish life, there was a choir and something like an orchestra in the temple which accompanied the sacrifices. So the music was definitely part of it. The Gaon of Vilna says that one of the things that Moses came down from Mount Sinai with is music. There was actually music that came down as part of the way in which a Jew should express himself. So it's definitely a positive thing. Yeah.
I've always found the idea of suffering a super interesting thought, like the Odyssey school of thought. And I was wondering if you could speak to the compatibility between human suffering and conceptions of God's omnipotence or benevolence, and just really I don't understand how there can be so much pain and anguish in the world, considering Hashem's supposed to be a good God and an all-powerful one too.
Okay, you put this in a very interesting way. You start with suffering as a general category, and you ask about God's beneficence, his loving kindness, and his omnipotence, and then you put in a quantitative modifier, how much there is. Actually, you're moving now, in philosophical terms, between two points, which was very heavily analyzed in the 20th century. And the idea that there is any suffering at all is something which is not hard to reconcile with an all-powerful, all-good God. There are many explanations, of which I'll present a couple, right? Then the question is, well, why should there be so much? But now it becomes very difficult to define how much is too much. If you recognize that there are purposes, positive purposes that suffering can serve, then to ask the question, you have to say, well, these are the positive purposes, this is how much they're worth, this is how much suffering there is, and it outruns one against the other. They're very difficult to prove. To put a quantity on it is very difficult to prove. So in a certain way, the way you structure the question, the answer sort of falls out of the way you put the question, which is not bad.
I'm happy to remove the quantitative aspect to it.
So, well, but then if so, then the question is why shouldn't there be a universe with no suffering at all? Well, let's see some of the things that suffering does. Let's take a person who has a certain character trait, and he feels confident in that character trait, and it's destructive to other people, and he doesn't appreciate that. One way you could wake him up is to have him incur some pain and suffering through that character trait, which would make him stop and think, now wait a minute, maybe this isn't so good after all. Maybe I ought to think about it again and come to examine it in a different way. That would mean that the pain and suffering is a benefit to him. It's a benefit to him. It does good for him. With children, you can have this in another way. Let's take a child who's very successful at everything. He's successful in his grades, he has good friends, he's good at sports, he's just good at everything. And therefore, he doesn't suffer any or almost any disappointment. Well, you as an adult can anticipate there will be disappointments. Will he be prepared for them? Will he be ready for them? Will this disappointment break him? In child rearing, the question is raised, should parents argue in front of the children or not? And there is a school of thought. Now, those of you who know me realize that I have a lot of caution and qualifications in dealing with schools of thought in psychology. This is a school of thought that you should never argue in front of the children because they can undermine their confidence in the marriage and create insecurity in them and so forth and so on. Others say, on the contrary, what the child needs to see is that the parents can argue and then come to a common view or willing to live with one another and express their love for one another afterwards, so that an argument doesn't cause a disequilibrium. It doesn't destroy them when an argument takes place, because arguments will take place. And the other school of thought is recommending that the parents argue in private. Okay, but what happens when the child gets married and has his first argument? He thinks it's all over because he never saw it. So, it's painful for the child. Yeah, it's painful, but it matures him. Now let's take something else. What about sports? Fairly serious sports, not professional, but serious sports. All sports involve pain. What's going on exactly? Are these people all masochists? Have they been hypnotized into punishing themselves? That's not how you feel when you play football. You don't feel that you're somehow sick and in the grips of a obsessive compulsive drive. You feel you're playing football. So maybe pain isn't the enemy. Maybe pain is something which, when you overcome it, you become a stronger person, a more self-reliant person. You trust yourself more because you can overcome pain. There are a lot of things that pain do for the person, and I'm talking now what we call nigla, in the open understanding of life without any Torah background. There are other things where the pain fulfills a certain Torah purpose, which is not open on the surface, and that would be other explanations as well. So there are many explanations for why pain exists in the universe. You want to see a source for it, The Way of God, Part 2, Chapters 2 and 3. Luzzatto goes about 8 different principles there of why people suffer, and they all serve a purpose. They all are productive. So that being the case, how can there be pain in the world if there's an all-good, all-powerful God? That question is answered by saying some of the pain is good. So it's part of his being all good. That pain really serves a good purpose. That the way we're built, the pain itself is something which is beneficial to us. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing response. And I can tell you're a philosopher. Could I refine my definition of suffering to make the question a little bit more?
Oh, sure.
So I think suffering is the disparity between the pain and the anguish of the suffering itself and the positive benefits. So, for example, something good may come of it, but does the good that comes of suffering justify the suffering itself? And I'm saying the suffering I'm asking about is that gap in the middle when the positive doesn't justify the negative.
Okay, but then you don't know that exists. You're asking, how can it be if God is all good and all powerful? I want to know why you think there is any suffering of that type. Why do you think that there is suffering that doesn't justify itself in the good that it produces?
Perhaps you're going to pull apart my example, but maybe for a child born in sub-Saharan Africa that's born straight into the world with HIV, for example, and dies before the age of 1, I struggle to see the sort of positive outcome of that. Perhaps it could be justified that it advances medical research and that it supports people in other parts of the world get access to the vaccinations they need, but for that individual, how can the suffering be justified?
Okay, now let me pull a rabbit out of the hat. You may not be aware of this. I'm glad you're sitting down. What about reincarnation?
That is a rabbit out of a hat.
Yeah, that's right. See? Nothing in that. We have a vast literature on reincarnation. So we don't measure a human life, a human history, from this birth to this death. End of story. The soul can be in the world many times. And no, we didn't take it from India. India got it from us. We're much older than Indian civilization. So that being the case, this 1 year of experience of that baby is one chapter in the history of a soul which comes into the world many times, and the value of its experiences is the sum total of its history, of which you are citing only one chapter. So then it's going to be very hard to argue that there are such cases.
Are you saying it's like the teshuvah of the baby to be born to suffering?
I'm sorry, say it again?
You're saying it's like teshuvah for the baby to be born to suffering, to live a life of pain?
I'll give you an example. I have this in my earlier book. Let's imagine a person who's a pirate 600 years ago in the Mediterranean. He sails from port to port and he attacks ships on the sea. And one of the things they do is they'll sail into a city on the seacoast, a small city, and they'll terrorize the city, and they will steal young children, 2-year-olds, and then sell them for slavery 1,000 miles away. Often enough, that child grows up, and all he knows is slavery. He doesn't remember his life before he was 2. Many people don't remember his life. I don't remember anything before I was 2. So he just grows up as a slave. How did he become a slave? Why is he a slave? I haven't got a clue. Something's happening to him for which he has no explanation whatsoever. How would you drive home to that pirate what he had done to that child? Well, one way you could do it is have him suffer something for which he has absolutely no explanation. Similarly to being born as a child with some kind of disability or some kind of a problem which causes him suffering, and then he dies. And then later, when his memory of being a pirate and his memory of that experience as being a baby are melded together, he says, aha, now I begin to realize what I did to those children. And now I can appreciate what it is that I have to rectify.
So if you argue that true evil doesn't really exist, then why should we pity anyone? Let's say we see a child born in a situation like that, and we decide, we shouldn't help him because that's just...
Okay, this is a standard question, and it applies all over. Vespasian asked this question of Rabbi Akiva: if your God loves the poor so much, let him support them. And the hidden stinger in the question is this: why is he poor? Isn't God running the world? So God made him poor, right? Well then, God wants him to be poor. So I'm interfering with God's management of the world if I give him money. He's sick. God's running health and illness. If he's sick, it's God because God made him sick. So if I cure him as a doctor, then I'm interfering the way God's running the world. Obviously, I shouldn't do that. No, obviously, that's a logical mistake. It's dumb. Because, number one, you don't say that he is poor. What you say is he has been poor. Is means it's a status he has and I shouldn't change it. No, he has no status. He has no status. It's a condition. Now, whether it should continue or not doesn't depend upon my reading God's mind and saying if he made him that way, he wants him to be that way. God gave us rules. I don't have to try to read his mind and figure out his philosophy. He gave us rules. He said, you see someone who's poor, give him charity. So then I say, which is what Rabbi Akiva said to Vespasian, God enables us to earn merit by correcting his poverty. The rule to me is to correct those things. Sometimes God makes a condition, not because he wants the condition to last forever, but he makes a condition because he wants the condition to be changed. After all, you were born as a baby. Should you remain as a baby for the rest of your life? I guess not, because he created it in such a way that you change and grow and develop. So he wants things to change and grow and develop. Nothing to stay the same. So it's going to be true across the board. We don't say, God made it, I shouldn't interfere. We say, God made it, what are his rules for it? Something shouldn't be interfered with, something should be interfered with. And you do it only by following the rules.
What are some things you can't interfere with?
We have a prohibition against doing anything to actively end a person's life, except when it's self-defense or capital punishment. But other than that, to the extent that if a person is dying and he's being kept alive by someone chopping wood, the rhythmic sound of the chopping of the wood is keeping him alive. There's a question as to whether you can tell him to stop chopping the wood, because that's keeping him alive. disconnecting you're not allowed to do that. You're allowed to do anything to hasten death. As one great contemporary Rav, Asher Weiss, said to me, my first wife was nifta 4 years ago. There's a difference between causing death and saving life and prolonging dying. So this, for example, is intubation. Let's say the person has trouble breathing. Should you put down a breathing tube? So he said, if the doctors say, with an interim of the breathing tube, we're hoping for a kind of recovery, and then we're able to take it out, then yes, because you could restore a better condition of life. But if the doctors say, once the tube goes in, it's never going to come out, because you kill the person immediately when you take it out, that you're just prolonging the dying process, then you wouldn't do that. But to do something to hasten death, you can't do. You cannot do. So that's one thing that you can't interfere with. Yes, in the back.
I want to go back to what we were talking a little bit earlier, and the example of the 1-year-old child who dies from AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, and the question of why do bad things happen to good people. I've heard this philosophical idea before, and I'm wondering about what space it has within Jewish thought, in terms of whether the idea that God cannot be all-powerful, all good, and also all-knowing at the same time. That the idea that God can be all good and all-powerful, but perhaps God does not know about the 1-year-old child who dies from AIDS, or God does not know about each individual's personal struggle, whether someone, let's say, is praying to God, and it's a question of whether those prayers are heard, but it's also a question of whether God hears and knows on every single little thing happening in the world, or whether God's always looking at everything. So I'm wondering, to what extent, does that idea have space in Judaism?
Okay, this is a very good question. Maimonides writes about it in detail in the Guide of the Perplexed. And the way you put it, I'm not quite sure what you meant at the beginning. You started off by saying that for God to be all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing isn't possible. Now
that God can't be all three of those things. God can only be two of those three things.
Right. That's what you said. But now, if I ask whether all three of them can be true of God, if I ask that question in isolation, no one thinks there's a contradiction there. The contradiction is between God being all good or powerful and all-knowing on the one hand, and there being evil. It's the existence of evil that causes one to doubt whether he could be all three. And the doubt is that if he's all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, then the evil shouldn't exist. That's what casts doubt on the trio. There's no independent problem with the trio. If you don't take evil into account, you could not argue there's an incompatibility between God's being all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing. There's no contradiction there whatsoever. It's only because it contradicts the existence of evil. That's where it starts from. And the medieval Arabic philosophers did talk about this, and some of them did deny that God knows everything, and some of them did deny his being all-powerful. They took this way because they didn't see any way to solve the problem. The way to solve the problem is to say that what looks to you to be evil, and of course you have to define evil here, evil means evil without any justification for its existence. There are evils of different kinds. And our answer is there is a justification for its existence. I mentioned some of them to him before. There are others as well. So that they don't contradict God's goodness. They're expressions of God's goodness. Some of the evils in the world are expression of his goodness because without those evils, some immensely superior good could not be achieved. So they are, that's why I said, evils with no justification for their existence. And evil can be a means to a much greater good. Here's a simple parallel, which is, you see a doctor, and they wheel the patient in, and he puts anesthesia, and he chops off his foot. You think, wow, what's going on here? I know, this is how they punish political prisoners, the guy's going to wake up with missing a foot. No. There was gangrene in his foot. Without severing the foot, he's going to die. Oh, so cutting off his foot now. So what do I say? This doctor's motives, his character, Can he be all good if he chops off his foot? Yeah, he can. All good. Perfectly virtuous. Because otherwise the guy will die. So there are evils that serve better purposes. Right. Problem now will only be if God's all-powerful, why does he need the evil in order to serve the better purpose? And there's an answer for that. If you want, if you look at my website, there's an article called Omnipotence and Evil Part 1, where I go through this in great detail. You can read about it there. But that's the idea. The trio of qualities in God are not inherently impossible to realize. They're perfectly consistent. The problematic is the three of them together seem to mean there can't be any evil. And the answer is the evils that you identify really serve the good and therefore not incompatible with God's goodness. That's the structure philosophically. Yeah.
Sorry. I think you glossed over what I think is a really, really important point, that considering God's omnipotence, why do we need to go through those stages of evil, and why do humans need to experience those sufferings?
Okay, I'll do this very briefly, but I did it there too.
Book, I'm also happy to just read it there if you want to answer.
Yeah, so we talk about God being omnipotent. Now, some people gloss that as God can do anything or everything. But actually, if you think about it, that gloss is problematic. Let's see. God can do anything. Let's try this, for example. God can learn something new. Learn something new. I mean, you and I can. It's a genuine ability. Does God have the ability to learn something new? I hope that sounds odd. How about God having the ability to improve? We have that ability. It's a genuine ability. Does God have the ability to improve? Doesn't sound like it, right? So the diagnosis here is not too difficult. Our conception of God is a conception of perfection. A perfect being would know everything already. He wouldn't have to learn something new. A perfect being can't be made better. It can't improve by definition. Perfect means than which there's no better. So there's no improvement is possible. So now we have to revise the gloss. It's not that he can do everything. You know, God can blank, fill in the blank any way you want. It's got to be true. No, that's not correct. Rather, it's something like this. God, as a perfect being, can do anything that a perfect being should be able to do. Some abilities are abilities that are only had by imperfect beings. We don't want to associate those abilities with him. Okay, that's one kind of qualification. Now, what about saying that God can make a square circle? So here, there's a certain amount of discussion about it, and Maimonides and others have a position that I don't understand. I'll tell you the way I understand it quickly. We don't want to say that God can make a square circle. Listen carefully. We don't want to say he can't make a square circle. We don't want to say either of them. Because square circle is a contradiction, and when we speak a contradiction, we don't make sense. We haven't said anything. We haven't described anything. To test God can, the words that come after can should be meaningful words that describe something to be done. So I say, you believe in God? You believe he's omnipotent? So then, how about God can blah? You say, what's blah? It's a sound. You heard me say it. You got to say yes because you are very frum. You are very religious. You got to say yes. No, I don't, because you didn't say anything. God can blah isn't a thing to say. It isn't a proposition. It isn't a sentence. Has no meaning. I just yes to that. I wouldn't say no either. I would just say, what? What linguists call the bizarreness reaction. What? God can blah? What are you talking about? So imagine, you're on your way to the mall, and a friend of you calls you up and says, you're going to the mall? Yeah. Listen, can you do me a favor? I need something. Well, I don't know if I have the ability. It's not too expensive, he says. Please pick up for me a square circle. What would you do? Where would you look? In the supermarket? In a clothes store? In a hobby store for a square circle? I think what you would say is, I don't get you, sorry. Maybe you could explain what you want in some other terms, because what you're telling me, I don't understand. I don't know what to do with square circle. I don't know how to, go about it. So now, if somebody says God can make a square circle, checkmate with only his king, or spell the word table correctly with 4 letters, or divide 2 into 9 with no remainder. When you put after the can words that describe contradictory states of affairs, the fault is not with God that he's limited and can't do it. The fault is there's no it to do. There's no it to do because the description doesn't describe something because of its failure. I'll tell you something else God can't do. God can't paint a portrait of Santa Claus. Can't. I hope I'm not breaking your hearts. There is no Santa Claus. We're on the same page? Okay. Right? Even God can't paint a portrait of Santa Claus because a portrait is a picture of a living being. And Santa Claus isn't a living being. These descriptions aren't candidates for things to be done. And they aren't limitations on his ability to do if we deny that he can do these things. Now, I claim, and this is what I've argued linguistically, I didn't do this in that paper, I claim that the idea of God building a world to get to, the ultimate good he wants to get to, with no evil in it, is a self-contradiction like square circle. So to ask, why doesn't he get to the end without the evil means, is like asking why doesn't he make a square circle, which is an illegitimate question. That's the position that I take. The string of connections you could see in the Way of God by Lutzada, chapter 2, where he strings together a number of the connections. They're truths by definition, and so the truths by definition, the question of whether doing one without the other doesn't arise because it's a contradiction. That's the structure of the argument. Okay. Very good. Very good.